And you know, you look at the history, it took about 5 to 10 years after the end of prohibition for bootlegging to really stop. So there's going to be a lag, right? From the time it goes legal federally, there's still going to be a number of years where these black market profiteers are going to, you know, strike while the iron's hot because they know it's a fading paradigm, and consumers are going to kind of shirk. You know, if you've been buying weed from the same person for 10 years and you trust them and you know what it is, if you all of a sudden leave them to go to like a Curaleaf or an Acres or a, you know, like a corporate cannabis entity, you're kind of leaving your buddy in the dirt here, right? Like this guy, he needs the income. This is part of his living or their living. So that's going to be a hard sell for a lot of people. But what with the data, again, in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and California now emerging, what the data clearly indicates is that as consumers become more aware of the benefits of engaging the regulated market for a safe, tested product with known percentages, but with the integrity and with the what we're doing on our packaging, and there's several packages. So you buy some ganja, there's a QR code on it. You scan that QR code and you can see when that seed was planted, when that plant was harvested, who harvested it, what did it get fed, when did it ever have pesticides applied to it, the testing. So not only the what we call the COA, the certificate of analysis, to make sure it's a safe, healthy product, but the testing in terms of cannabinoid percentages, in terms of flavonoid, terpenoid, essential oil percentages, all that good stuff. Like you're going to be able to swipe a QR code on your phone and you'll be able to see the whole life cycle of that product.
Welcome to the 62nd episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest was born in Queens, New York. He attended elementary school there, followed by middle school in Florida, and attended high school at the American School in Japan, where he graduated in 2005. Upon graduating from the University of Florida, he worked at Digital Domain as a studio operations coordinator. He spent several years as a medicinal cannabis farmer. He then started up Jigsaw Earth Consulting as a consulting firm in 2015. Today, he joins us as the Chief Executive Officer at Shasta Grown, a vertically integrated cannabis supply chain company located on the slopes of Mount Shasta in the city of Weed, California. Welcome to the podcast, Ray.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nick.
Good to see you, buddy.
Yeah.
Been over a decade. Do you go by Raymond or Ray now? I noticed there's two different...
Yeah, you know, I mean, people call me Ray all the time. When I speak in front of voter groups or elected officials, if I'm at the podium on a public meeting, I do try to introduce myself as Raymond. But that's also partially because if I say Ray Strack too fast, people think I'm giving a nickname, like my nickname is Ray Strack, and it's like, no, it's just Ray Strack. So it's either way. You can call me whatever you want, bud.
All right. Well, today we'll talk a bit about, I think quite primarily, the conversation will surround, your profession in regards to being the CEO at Shasta Grown, and sort of the, anything from the legal to, logistical challenges you face. First, I want to jump to sort of, the crux of this podcast is a lot about, international schools, TCKs, et cetera. You have this unique perspective of spending, part of your formative years, your middle school years in Florida, and then you finish the rest of your, secondary education in Tokyo. So I was wondering, for you, having experienced both sort of that international school world and the U.S. school, how did those two experiences compare for you?
Oh, night and day. I mean, without going into excruciating detail, the public schools that I went to were not good. So coming to a school like ASIJ, where teachers really cared about the students, where the scholarly pursuits were lauded as opposed to made fun of, was a tremendous change, and something that I didn't even know I wanted. And then to be able to have that opportunity was just astounding. And I'm a really lucky guy, and I've experienced a lot of cool things in my life. And obviously I'm doing something pretty cool with my time nowadays. But at the end of the day, moving to Japan and having those years there and opening my eyes to other cultures was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me.
And what brought your family over to Japan?
My father worked for the federal government, for the Department of Treasury, and then subsequently Homeland Security after they reorganized. But he was the assistant attaché for the U.S. Customs Treasury Department at the embassy in Tokyo.
So you were sort of that truly expat ambassador kid.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, now we went to school with a fair few folks that were also embassy kids. However, the vast majority of positions at an embassy are generally State Department. So there's actually, not all embassies have a Treasury Department office and representation. So unlike folks whose parents worked as, say, consular officers in the State Department, where they really did move to country after country after country after country, going to Japan was really the only time that we moved overseas. We did, as you pointed out, move from New York City to Florida, but the vast majority of postings within the Treasury Department are domestic within the United States. So to be able to have that opportunity speaks to, first of all, my father's acumen in his career, and secondly, to the fact that we have such a broad, diverse, economically in-depth relationship between the United States and Japan. So London has Treasury Department representatives. A lot of the bigger embassies, Seoul does, of course, Rome, but we had some friends that, their parents worked at the embassy in countries that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of bilateral trade with, and those embassies don't have Treasury Department representation.
Interesting. And as you mentioned, we had various friends who were embassy kids, and, we visited some of those places. I remember going to the Swedish embassy, for example. And among the embassy kids, did you guys sort of have compare which places were the best places to visit, and which embassies sort of were the less?
A little bit. I think the bigger dichotomy was less between different embassies and more between kids who were there because their parents were in embassy versus kids whose parents were in private industry. Because quite frankly, to be blunt about it, that's a different socioeconomic sphere, right? I mean, and you had a great posting the other day about, the increases in tuition at ASIJ. The U.S. government paid more for me and my sister to go to ASIJ than I ended up paying to go to a top 5 public university in the United States. And the fact of the matter is that on a government employee salary, my father could have never afforded that. And so I think that the difference there really was more between kids whose parents footed the bill themselves versus those that either the company was paying the bill, that was quite common too, right? Or the government was paying the bill. And that has to do with supply and demand and the fact that there's tons of, expats in Tokyo. But no, I definitely remember, Vasil, for instance, being the Bulgarian embassy is like an office. It's like one office, and the United States embassy, as you know, is this huge compound with hundreds of employees. And, so there was definitely a distinction, but I'd say, me in retrospect, looking back at it, the bigger dichotomy was between those kids whose parents were in private industry versus public service.
Yeah, the tuition definitely is a topic that comes up quite often. I recently I've been using this app called Clubhouse a lot. I don't know if you're.
Oh yeah, no, we were talking about this. I just got on that too, man. I love it. My girlfriend pissed at me because I'm on it all the time.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting way to sort of converse with people about topics that maybe, are beyond your inner circle friend group. And I've been talking to a lot of parents or prospective parents for international schools. And that's the number one topic, as it always has been, right? As someone once said, it's the economy, stupid. I think it's the tuition, stupid, but it's
it's more than a lot of people end up paying for college. Like I said, I mean, it's not a cheap endeavor to send your children to a top tier international school.
Definitely. And it's definitely a conversation every family needs to have. And, I think we were very fortunate that we got our education at the international.
Oh my goodness. I mean, listen, I got into quote unquote better schools than the University of Florida. University of Florida was a top 10, now a top 5 public university in the United States. But the reason that I went there was because those quote unquote better schools that I got into, for the most part, were private. And again, on a government employee salary, that's a very tough pill to swallow. Whereas The United States gives an allowance for if you are positioned overseas on behalf of the federal government, whatever state you moved from, you retain in-state tuition access. So I was able to go to the University of Florida on in-state tuition, even though I didn't live in Florida, because that had been the last place I lived.
I had no idea about that in-state tuition status. That's actually
yeah. It's like a federal government policy. You know, if you get positioned overseas due to a job, you retain some of the benefits from living in that state, be it the property taxation rate, or in the case of Florida, what they call the homestead exemption tax structure, and several other components. But yeah, in-state tuition is one of those.
That's so important. And I think people forget how expensive things are getting. So I'm just going to repeat, I think what I probably have mentioned in at least a few other podcasts. It's not like $40,000-$50,000 anymore for the expensive ones. And you know, your NYUs, your USCs. I just checked the other day. We're talking about 75K, times 4 years. So we're talking about $300,000. So, you know, we're talking about a small house in the burbs. For 4 years.
No, I paid $8,000 a year for a top 10 public university.
Yeah, so it's becoming more important than ever. It's that, you know, this is more for the people in the States, right? But to really take advantage and leverage that in-state status, because, you know, simply private schools are just perhaps not, you know, the best option in regards to
the buck, right? Yeah, I mean, again, like University of Florida is very well regarded. I mean, you tell people that you graduated with 2 degrees from UF, they're like, word, gotcha. Like, it's a known entity. Everyone knows the academics are solid. You know, it was a great school. And, you know, I was there for, if anybody in the viewership here is a college sports aficionado, I was there for all of the Tebow years. So I got 2 basketball and 2 football national championships back to back. It was wild. The speech afterwards where he was like crying, he was like, "I'll never let you down again." I was at that game, you know, like, because we had student tickets. Why wouldn't you?
Definitely. That seems like that was a blast. And I mean, there you majored in linguistics and anthropology. So why those 2 majors?
Honestly, to be, again, I'm going to be blunt. I'm going to tell you the truth. I wanted to go work for the State Department. I had seen what that lifestyle was like. I saw what the caliber of the individuals that worked in the State Department. I interned for the State Department. And so those were courses of study that I thought would be very applicable. And I had been informed, quite frankly, that would be very applicable, particularly for language school, for your postings overseas, to have a background in linguistics and phonetics. But, you know, turns out the State Department doesn't really want you if you get arrested for possession of controlled substance at the age of 20. Oh, that's part of my life story, man. I mean, if that hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't be where I am today, right? Like, that galvanized, you know, the fact that I wanted to live somewhere where my lifestyle was not criminalized, where I could pursue my interests without fear of law enforcement interactivity. And it's one of the reasons, I had friends that were doing the medical cannabis thing who have now gone on to found very successful companies and who are doing quite well for themselves in this new legalized market. But they had been out here for several years and doing the deal and learning the trade, learning the craft. And they, you know, were like, dude, you know, just get out here, man. You learn what this is. Within the next 10 years, it's going to be legalized. We're going to be sitting pretty. We're going to be right where you need to be to, like, legitimize the industry. And I thought to myself, man, well, you know, I got arrested in Florida for what I think should not have been a crime. Why wouldn't I go to a state where that activity would not have gotten me arrested, right? If I had gone to university in California and there would not have been an arrest, and perhaps I would have gone to the State Department and taken the Foreign Service exam, which I was like slated to do. But because of that, it was like, they're never going to take you. And so I pursued a different path. And quite frankly, if I had known everything I know now, I would have pursued a degree in a hard science or a STEM. But because I thought I was going to go, you know, learn a new language every 5 years and interact with other cultures and do the whole, like I said, the Foreign Service officer thing, that was a big reason why I pursued that course of study at university.
Interesting. So that was a real pivotal moment for you.
Yeah. I had never been inside a jail cell before. What? No. What?
And I mean, once that transpired, is that was it from around that point that you decided California, or was there a few years in between until you
There were a few years. There were a few years in between because I had at the time I was doing site operations for large live music festivals. I was on the team that would develop the site map, kind of comb through local ordinances for event permit issuances for several thousands and tens of thousands of persons, and do the site map. Where's the stage going to go? Where's the camping going to go? Okay, that means by law, for every 1,000 campers, you have to have this many bathrooms. You have to have lights. We have to have, medical facilities. We have to have, emergency health professionals on staff. I really enjoyed that work. I really did. I loved it. It was gratifying. It was fun. The people I worked with were interesting. But you know what it is? That is a profession where you live on the road like 40 weeks a year, 40 plus weeks a year. And I didn't really want that. So I parlayed that experience into the operations position at the visual effects studio, where a lot of the workflow modeling, a lot of the standardization, a lot of there was a lot of crossover. And so I was able to make that happen. And I was very happy there. It was a great job right out of college, decent salary, good benefits, interesting people to work with. But that company ended up going under in some corporate malfeasance, not due to any of the employees, but
this is referring to Digital Domain, right? Just to
correct. Yeah. Digital Domain. It was a company founded by James Cameron in the mid 90s. They worked with Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic on, the Star Wars prequels. I mean, that was before I got there, of course. And then they did a lot of what they call stereoscopic image modeling, which there was a point in time, if you recall, where they were re-releasing old 2D movies in 3D. And that technology to make a 2D movie into 3D is called stereoscopic imaging. And Digital Domain owned one of the underlying patents for that technology. So that's a lot of what they did. So we also did all the special effects for the re-release of Tron with Jeff Bridges and all the Transformer movies.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
It was really cool. It was a great job. But I went in one Friday and was handed a box along with 600 other people and said, You got to clear out your desk. This is your last paycheck. Peace.
Wow. Yeah, you hear about those stories, but you were one of those people with the boxes, huh?
Yeah. In fact, as the operations coordinator, I had to distribute the boxes. It was awful because I answered to the COO. So he called me that morning. He goes, Raymond, something happened. I need you to take the company card. I need you to go Home Depot. I need you to buy several hundred, cardboard boxes. And I said, oh, no, you're kidding. You got to be kidding me, right? He goes, no, dude, I don't know. I don't really know what happened. The CEO called me this morning. We have to cease operations. It was brutal.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're there for several years, and then you move up north, right?
Yeah.
And were you already in Shasta at that point, or were you?
No. So Digital Domain had offices in Florida, LA, and Vancouver. But no, I actually, right after that, I moved to a place called Grass Valley, Nevada City area, which is in the foothills, kind of between Sacramento and Reno, and the foothills of the Sierras, approaching the 80, approaching Lake Tahoe. So I worked there between there at some farms there, and between there and San Francisco proper at an indoor, a warehouse growing facility. And I spent the better part of 18 months bouncing between those two spots, kind of learning the trade, because I didn't know anything about plant botany or cultivation or nutrient regimens or, any of it. I knew that I liked smoking weed. That's about it.
I mean, it sounds like sort of almost like an apprenticeship.
That I describe it like that quite often.
And during that time, was there any moments where you were like, all right, maybe I should consider another area, or I go back to, Digital Domain, or were you totally sold at that point? This is what
I was totally sold, because listen, like I said, during my time at Digital Domain, several of my very good buddies who were in the cannabis industry already, who have, like I said, have gone on to found some pretty big companies, and who we have a professional relationship with, right? We work with them. My company works with them. My friends who were in the cannabis industry already while I was at Digital Domain had been literally being what are you doing, dude? You're working at a job where there's limited mobility. we're like leading the charge of a cutting edge industry that's gonna become legal. And like, this is an opportunity to make your mark, right? To like start a business, to potentially have a very lucrative exit if you play your cards right, which is, you know, kind of not inevitable, but there's a high degree of probability that's where it ends up with my company, right? And so, no, I mean, once I got in it and learned what the work was and everything, I was back with my people. I loved it. The transition from digital domain, that decision was made for me, much like the decision with the State Department, where like that decision was kind of made for me by just the situation was in charge of that one, right?
Yeah.
And no, once I dug my fingers into it, man, I was very happy, and I still am.
And, you know, you're mentioning stuff about, you know, the future of the industry, or the future, which is, I guess, now, back then. And just to sort of reiterate sort of the history of what has, you know, transpired in regards to the cannabis industry in the United States. 96, medical marijuana is legalized in California, right? And
the
recreationally,
Passionate Care Act.
Yeah, and recreationally, first state was Colorado about 8 years ago. When this was all transpiring, this was about late 2000s, right? Early to late 2000s to early 2010s. With what's going on right now in the States, and I know we're jumping all the way forward to 2021, but why not, right?
Sure,
I know here we talked a bit about the SAFE Act. So can you maybe explain to viewers what is a SAFE Act and why is it so important in the cannabis
Absolutely.
industry now?
So currently the legalized adult use cannabis industries in any states, of which there are, I believe, currently 17, if I recall correctly, off the top of my head, that have legalized full adult use beyond, you know, medical. If you include medical and limited access states, we're talking about, I believe, 45 of the 50 or 42 of the 50. Those companies pay federal taxes. We pay federal taxes, but cannot access FDIC insured banking access. That is both on the lending side, which creates a number of issues within the industry as far as access to capital for construction financing and for infrastructure development, as well as creates, quite frankly, a public health and safety risk because of the large amounts of cash involved in these transactions. And as you know, and anybody that watches the news in California or Colorado or Oregon or Washington, there's no shortage of stories of dispensaries and delivery drivers, et cetera, being robbed at gunpoint because those criminals know that it's a cash industry. And quite frankly, also the product has a certain black market value. So the SAFE Act allows state licensed cannabis businesses to interact with banks just like every other business. So we don't have to use cash. So we don't have to go to exploitative capital, you know, venture capital, which they call vulture capital, right? Where these people are just trying to get a buck out of you because they know you don't have access to the banks. And so that's going to change everything.
And my understanding is the current status of it is that it's Congress, it seems to go past no issue, but it's at the Senate level where there's the sort of a roadblock. So is there a chance that it could pass just through executive order, or is it something that would have to go through Senate?
No, it has to go through because it deals with the banking subcommittees. It has to be a legislative process. That being said, with the wins in Georgia recently, you know, it only lost in the Senate by the 2-vote differential. And so it's going to be reintroduced. Chuck Schumer has already said, and Cory Gardner and several of the Republicans who are very much in favor of the bill because it's a really bipartisan issue. It really is. You know, like I forget what the last poll was, but something like 67+% of Americans want cannabis federally deregulated or descheduled. So it's a very, you know, broad support issue. And I mean, Colorado, a great example. I mean, you know, Oklahoma now has one of the broadest adult use markets in the country. And those are deep red states. Or, well, Colorado is now what they call the purple, but Oklahoma, I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's quite red.
Yeah. So, you know, the from an operator standpoint, what it's going to change is the safety risk for folks that are carrying large amounts of cash. It's going to impact the taxation rate, where right now, unlike most businesses, cannabis businesses cannot utilize certain categories of COGS, of cost of goods sold, for tax deduction purposes. And arguably for our company, most impactful, it means that for the $65 million worth of construction that we are going to engage in over the next 2+ years, we can get a significantly lower interest rate in a traditional construction financing loan from a financial institution, as opposed to having to go to a private capital source.
That makes so much sense. That, as you mentioned earlier, just the cash creates all those issues, and it's kind of basically bullying at the federal level, and hopefully these things will be amended.
Well, and the passing of the hemp farm bill really changed the dynamic, right? Because in the law, there's this distinction between cannabis and hemp, which does not exist in science. Like, to be very blunt, they're the same plant. They're different varietals of the same plant. The big thing right now that's coming into the mainstream is that you can take CBD, and if you put it through the right chemical process, you can turn it into what they call delta 8 THC. Delta 8 THC is THC, but because it's derived through a chemical process from CBD, it's federally legal because the law is so specific, right? This Controlled Substances Act calls out cannabis sensimilia over 0.03% THC delta 9, because that is the active component. With a little chemical tweaking, you can turn CBD into delta 8 THC, which means it has one less, not methoxy ring. Again, I should have got a chem degree. This is what I'm talking about. Because I've learned all this as a craft, as a trade. But I
wouldn't know if you were wrong about what you were saying, though. That means
no, it's okay. Well, that's why I'm not going to try and quote the chemical processing involved, because that's not really my department. I have a great chemist on staff, and I have about a half a dozen qualified applicants who have submitted resumes for that particular department of my company. But that's like a Steve Jobs thing, right? You got to hire people who know more than you. The movement to, although, recently, and this is big actually, and this is what's going to spur change in a lot of these countries that haven't internalized the change in drug laws, is that the UN World Health Organization recently voted to lessen the tier of scheduling for cannabis on a global scale, right? So theoretically, within the next 2 to 5 or 3 to 5 years, whatever it is, all UN member countries have to amend their laws to reflect the World Health Organization's guidelines on cannabis.
That's good. That's a big change.
That's really recent. That's like within the past 6 to 8 months.
Your public speaking, though, man, you are always pretty good. I remember you were on the UN MUN team. So
thank you.
Look at MUN. It's paying off now, though, huh?
Oh goodness! Honestly, I am. And in fact, it's one of the reasons I was pushed into this role. A lot of people in my industry are used to being deemed a criminal, quite frankly, and as a result, they are very hesitant to get their name and face out there. In fact, I can tell you some stories about guys who, and ladies, who years prior to legalization were advocates for legalization, who went to public meetings, county supervisors, city council, and they gave their name and address. You know what happened 3 months later?
No.
Cops came.
Oh my God.
They got raided.
Yeah.
Because they had the audacity. They had the audacity to engage in public discourse.
Wow.
That's fucked up.
So Shasta Grown and Shasta Growth. Can you tell us a bit about sort of the parent company, as well as how did this all come to fruition after, your apprenticeship, and then there was the time, and then you started up the consulting firm, and what started your current endeavor as CEO and co-founder?
Well, it was my brainchild. It was my baby. I saw the long game. I knew that I lived in a place that had 25 years of decrease in living wage employment. I knew that I know that I live in a economically depressed area, quite frankly, and I knew that cannabis was a potential stepping stone toward economic revitalization. So I had been here at my property, which is a beautiful 5-acre parcel that has an amazing view that looks at the mountain that I grew at for, better part of 10 years. And we didn't know what legalization was going to look like. So as you are probably aware, every state has had a slightly different rollout of what legalization looks like. In Colorado, it was one thing. In Washington, it was another. In Oregon, it was another. In even the more limited license states where there's either medical only or nascent adult use, and no one knew what California was going to look like. And so here in my county, we had a situation where there really wasn't a whole lot of political appetite for, quite frankly, for permit issuance. So in California, in order to qualify for a state cannabis license, you have to have a local jurisdiction, either a county or a city, sign off on your project. There are various ways to go about that. Some places it's easier, some places it's harder, some places it can't happen at all because the local use component of the state legislature allows counties and cities to either opt in or opt out. And if you opt out, you opt out. You're not obliged by state law to issue cannabis permits. And if you opt in, you can include any number of land use mechanisms to either minimize or encourage cannabis businesses to move there. And there's plenty of examples of both. But, in California, we have, I believe, 52 counties and 346 cities. Numerically, less than 1/3 of those jurisdictional governments are issuing cannabis permits.
Why would those local jurisdictions choose to, not take advantage?
Because they think their constituents don't want them, right? The elected officials think that they're gonna lose their position because their church group that they can count on for a couple hundred votes. I mean, these are local elections that are decided with, think about, again, rural areas. I live in a town of 2,500 people in a county of 45,000 people. City council people get elected with 250 votes and county officials get elected with 1,300 to 1,500 votes. It only takes a couple hundred people saying, F you, for you to lose your position as an elected official. And with it, your salary and your benefits and the prestige, quite frankly, right? I mean, so there's lots of places where the entrenched power structure, be it big ag, be it cattle ranchers associations, be it, whatever industry is extant there that doesn't want to see sort of a green rush, right? Which is that phrase you hear over and over again about people coming in and buying properties they think are going to qualify because all of a sudden a property that was worth $100,000 is now worth $750,000. And it's just like, it's crazy. So in our county, to be very blunt, and there's plenty of news articles about this, we have a rather robust illicit, black market cultivation problem, right? That are run by organized crime rings that are associated with other criminal activity. And so there was a fear in our county that creating a broadly accessible permitting would allow for the furtherance of illicit activity under the guise of legal cannabis and thus inhibit law enforcement from pursuing those illicit activities. So for instance, I mean, that's a lot to take in and it's a complicated situation. There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of impacts on local communities. But the fact of the matter is that because of the continuing federal illegality of cannabis, there is a marketplace for black market cannabis in states where there is not adult use access or medicinal access. And we always point to alcohol prohibition in the 1910s as the single closest parallel. And you know what? For those years, criminal enterprises made tons of money because people could not get a product that they wanted. And it's as simple as that. And you look at the history, it took about 5 to 10 years after the end of Prohibition for bootlegging to really stop. So there's going to be a lag, right? From the time it goes legal federally, there's still going to be a number of years where these black market profiteers are going to, strike while the iron's hot because they know it's a fading paradigm, and consumers are going to kind of shirk. If you've been buying weed from the same person for 10 years and you trust them and you know what it is, if you all of a sudden leave them to go to like a Curaleaf or an Acres or a corporate cannabis entity, you're kind of leaving your buddy in the dirt here, right? Like this guy, he needs the income. This is part of his living or their living. So that's going to be a hard sell for a lot of people. But what with the data, again, in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and California now emerging, what the data clearly indicates is that as consumers become more aware of the benefits of engaging the regulated market for a safe, tested product with known percentages but with the integrity and with the what we're doing on our packaging, and there's several packages. So you buy some ganja, there's a QR code on it. You scan that QR code and you can see when that seed was planted, when that plant was harvested, who harvested it, what did it get fed, when did it ever have pesticides applied to it, the testing. So not only the what we call the COA, the certificate of analysis, to make sure it's a safe, healthy product, but the testing in terms of cannabinoid percentages, in terms of flavonoid, terpenoid, essential oil percentages, all that good stuff. Like, you're going to be able to swipe a QR code on your phone and you'll be able to see the whole life cycle of that product. And that's how you get consumers away from the unregulated market.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So sorry, that was kind of a tangent, but to go back to your original question. So I got very politically involved here where I live. As a result, I had to follow the letter of the law because, as I gave you the anecdote earlier, there are lots of examples, unfortunately, for better or worse, of law enforcement coming after people who had the audacity to engage in public discourse and advocate for legalization. You know, there are people who tell these horror stories of going to their county supervisor's meeting or their city council meeting and talking about how I'm a medical cannabis farmer and I think we should do this and this and this. And like 3 months later, they're getting raided by the sheriff because he didn't like that you had the cojones to get up at the podium and give your name and address.
And have you seen sort of an evolution in regards to people being a bit more, I guess you used the word, having political appetite in regards to sort of representing their position in regards to medicinal use?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. It's kind of like you hate to use the phrase because they're apples and oranges, but it's a coming out of the closet moment, right? There's people who are like, you hear these stories, these anecdotal kind of stories of people like standing in a room and hearing their friends talk shit and being like, what are you guys talking about? Do you guys not smoke weed? Like, what? And the inverse as well, right? Like, people being like, well, I know you guys all like smoking weed, but like, what if our kids get it? And it's like, all right, but that's why you have regulatory safeguards, right? That's that's like an old Nancy Reagan, Reagan era drug war thing where like drug dealers will sell to your kids. Well, guess what? You go to a liquor store, you have to show an ID. Go to a cannabis store, you have to show an ID.
Yeah.
If you have a multi-million-dollar business on the line that could be taken away from you in an instant, if you're caught selling to an underage person. Now, for the record, Shasta Grown does not engage in retail sales. We are a supply chain company, so I don't have to deal with this on a daily basis. But yeah, I mean, the reality of the situation is that if a business owner has assets and the business on the line, they're not going to skirt those regulations to make $25 to some 17-year-old kid. I mean, that's why even alcohol sales to minors are sort of like an aberration, although being of that age in Japan was a different story.
Yeah, I feel like it's a whole another conversation maybe for another time, but I think you bring up a great sort of, the analogy of the 1910s, Al Capone, right? That was about 7 years, I think. And I was actually kind of thinking another sort of analogy. It's like sex education, right? When it wasn't, or it still isn't in some places, when it's not robust and transparent, you get a bunch of teenage pregnancies. And 100%. When you're very open to, people about, this is how you use a condom, this is what contraceptives look like, all of a sudden things like teenage pregnancy is down. So I think, it's definitely a great point you bring up, that even if you're for it or against it for whatever reason, it's like the conversation has to take place. And that wasn't even where we were at least 20, 30 years ago.
No, absolutely. And I guess this is a great time to bring up the fact that, we talked a little bit about my dad and his position at the embassy. Now, he's been retired for quite some time now. In his retirement, he got to say things that he could never have said as a federal government employee. And I'm very, very proud to say that he is now a national spokesperson for a group called LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Action Partnership. It is a criminal justice reform lobbying organization. It was formerly known as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and they had a very singular lobbying task. They pointed to places like Amsterdam, Portugal, places where there had been a movement to move controlled substance misuse out of law enforcement and into public health. Mm-hmm. And that's what they advocated for. And I'm very proud to say Ray, Big Ray, it's one of the things he does with his time now. And I'm very, very proud of him.
Wow. So, instead of you following your dad's footsteps, your dad ended up sort of following some of your footsteps, perhaps.
Apples and trees, right? It's an interesting thing, but yeah, no, I'm very, very proud of him, man. It's amazing to see.
That's really cool, man. And, it's an industry that's evolving, right? At a pace we haven't seen.
Rapidly.
I don't really know what to compare it to.
Even tech bros who have now gotten into cannabis will tell you unequivocally, our industry is moving faster than even tech moved in the late 90s.
So I think this, leads well into, the last question I like to ask the guests is, what do they see themselves doing 2-3 years, 10 years from now? But I want to sort of morph that into also your industry in general. What would you tell someone who's quite a novice like me? What will the industry look like 2-3 years from now? And what will the industry look like 10 years from now?
I think it's going to look like wine. I think it's going to look like wine. I think you're going to have a stratification of quality to where you can buy a box of Franzia, or you can buy a $300 bottle of wine or $1,000 bottle of wine or whatever it is. You're going to have increasing awareness of appellations, right? Which is a concept very common in wine. And I'm proud to say that I was actually one of the appointed members of the California Department of Food and Agriculture's Appellations Criteria Development Committee in Sacramento. I helped write those regulations. I lobbied for that to be included in the law and was given an opportunity to help write those regulations. And I think that you're going to see an increase in consumer awareness about the various uptake mechanisms that cannabis offers, as well as the medicinal benefits that the plant offers. I mean, did you know that the fastest growing cannabis use segment is senior citizens?
No, not know that.
Yeah. And they're using it to get off of pharmaceuticals. They're using it to get off pharmaceuticals.
That's interesting. And I imagine also for things like joint pain and whatnot, that's probably more prevalent with senior citizens, and CBD oil and whatnot
they have more health ailments, so they seek out more, analgesics or what have you. And, there's story after story of elderly folks going, man, I stopped taking OxyContin because I can just eat this edible or eat this Rick Simpson oil or whatever it is.
Wow. So
that's powerful, man. That's powerful.
Yeah, because isn't OxyContin and opiates
are an opiate? They're
the next
There have been several studies done indicating that opioid use decreases in states with adult use access markets. Plenty of data.
So it seems like it's a multiple layers. It seems to be moving in the right direction.
We didn't know how legalization was going to roll out in California, and all these states have different legalization regulations, and they vary from state to state. They're not kind of codified. And so what my partner and I did, Matthew Dodson, who's on our website, is my co-founder. He's a longtime friend and business partner. We started a consulting firm. And what we did is we looked at the underlying root of what doesn't the traditional medical market have that a regulated market is going to mandate. And one of the first answers we came up with was written SOPs and public health and safety framework for consumables manufacturing. And so when I got politically involved here in my county, and like I said, had to follow the letter of the law, and I had to severely limit the amount of plants that I had, which obviously is a direct correlation to how much money I make. I took a gig up in Southern Oregon in the year that Oregon went adult use legal. And I opted not to become a part of that company and to remain an independent contractor. And as a result, the documentation that I prepared on their behalf then became the basis for the consulting firm. And so we wrote up what's called a HACCP plan. It's a hazard analysis and critical control point plan. It is a federally standardized, internationally mandated consumables manufacturing safety framework. Every product that you put in or on your body has the facility that makes that product has a HACCP plan. And it's very basic. It identifies physiological, biological, and chemical points of potential contamination and sets rules and limits to mitigate the potential for contamination of a consumable product. It's a very broad kind of outline. It was developed by NASA in the 60s for use in the space program. And so we did that to hedge our bets because, okay, if we can't get permits, we know that everybody that gets a permit is going to need one of these. And we can just go sell this to permit holders. And so that's what we did. We didn't end up having to do it. Like, it didn't end up being a long-term business model because we were successful in obtaining permits, but it was a hedge against what if we couldn't get permits. Also, simultaneously, the development of that documentation, because it's in a format that is very accessible to public officials, be they Department of Health, Agriculture Department, whatever, this is the same sort of framework that they're used to seeing in every other industry. And so it became a very fundamental underlying IP component of the company's ability to get permits.
Wow.
So fast forward a little bit. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was wondering, so with your partner's background, did you guys use, was there a specific industry that you guys sort of used as a, what's the word I'm thinking of, as a blueprint?
Yeah.
To, setting up your rules?
A little bit, yes. There's definitely parallels to agriculture at large. There's parallels to viticulture, to the wine industry, alcohol, liquor, distillation, right? Same chemical process. The product that goes in most what people call vape pens, right? Like the pens that you smoke. That product goes through a chemical process that is literally the exact same chemical process as alcohol goes through in liquor. If it's distillate, if it's a distillation, alternately, if you're using a hydrocarbon solvent, it's the exact same chemical process that you would use to extract essential oils from a plant like lavender oil or rosemary oil or what, something you buy at the health food store, right? The chemical process that extracts that constituent molecule from that plant is the exact same process that we use in cannabis to extract cannabinoids and terpenes. So yes, of course, there were blueprints. That being said, HACCP as a theory and as a protocol is at its core sort of open source, right? It's very broad. It's meant to be as applicable as humanly possible. So that's why I say all it does is you write down what your process is, you analyze your process, where are the potential points of contamination? Okay, we've identified those. Now, how do we mitigate that potential? So I'll tell you what, I haven't discussed this explicitly with him, but I would reckon to wager that Shinji's facility with the Japanese white turmeric, when they extract that, they have a HACCP plan.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he and I have spoken a little bit because CBD is big in the healthcare space. And so he and I have definitely exchanged notes on a couple of things and, very, very excited to see. That's actually one thing I really want to say. I've really enjoyed looking over your guest list and watching some of the ones that I hadn't checked out because I knew the person. It's just, it really speaks to the quality of education. Back to your super original point, it really speaks to the quality of education that there's just so many people in such a wide variety of fields who have achieved a level of success, and they can point to their time at an international school and the caliber of education they receive, they can point back to that as being an integral component in their success. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Definitely. That, and I'm happy that you're one of the 12 people that have seen some of those other episodes.
Hey, dude, some of them I was looking. Some of them have a couple thousand views.
Yeah. There's a few that have got some hits. But I mean, either way, I always tell people the intention's not really to get a bunch of views. We can always do that with other ways, right? Yeah.
To document the real. Huh? Well, I'll tell you what, man. Our marketing guy, one of our initial angel investors, and our kind of marketing guru, he's been telling me for ages that I need to they call it create your personal brand, and I was like, that sounds really lame. What are you talking about? And so this is now the second podcast or interview thingy that I've done. The other one was also with an old friend, and there are no less than 5 or 6 more scheduled for the coming months.
Oh, wow.
Because the industry is so exciting. I've been asked to speak at a couple of conferences, be they virtual or in person, particularly my experience on that California Department of Food and Agriculture board has gotten to a position where companies are literally cold calling me being like, yo, we saw that you were one of the contributing authors on yada, yada, yada. Can we pick your brain? How much is it going to cost us to pick your brain? And I'm like, I don't know, man. This is my brain. Get out. Do your own research. It's not that hard. I can send you the links. And actually, that was funny. I was in a Clubhouse room the other day where I was given some secret sauce type shit. And there were 8 speakers and 150 listeners. And the moderator was like, Ray, every cannabis consultant in the room is super pissed at you right now because you just told people how to do it for themselves. I thought that was really funny.
Oh man, that's it. As we talked a bit off air, and we don't have to go into the details, but it's definitely an industry that is it's just growing, man, and it's exciting. In regards to the magnitude and in regards to it's the social impact as well, very positive, right? Whether it's elderly people having less pain in their joints and getting off of opioids, or younger people having the knowledge, right? No longer
the knowledge and the very famous joke. Bill Murray, right? I think it was Bill Murray, said the most dangerous thing about pot is getting caught with it.
That's a great point. Yeah. It's
crazy. The fact that my potential career was derailed because of something that I'm now building a company for. I mean, what a time to be alive, right? Jesus.
Yeah, it's definitely crazy how things change, usually for the better as we grow older. And on that note, I know I asked you about, what you see in regards to the industry 5 years now, from 10 years from now. My last question to you is, where do you see yourself 2-3 years down the line, and maybe even in the next few decades?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be running this. I'm going to be doing this for the foreseeable future. I mean, even in the event of an exit, for the most part, the acquiring company tends to keep founders and C-level staff on for a couple of years. So even if 5 or 6 years from now we sell a chunk of the company, I would have to stay on for that integration period. So there's going to be a lot of consolidation in the industry because you have these siloed states with some with supply chain, some with retail, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, great example. Those states have arguably the largest consumer base, and they have no supply chain infrastructure. And so with the advent of the SAFE Act, which, as we talked about, looks like it's going to be reintroduced in March, there is a burgeoning awareness of the fact that there's a halfway decent chance, and I'm actually kind of betting on the model that cannabis for interstate commerce, at least initially, is going to most closely model is that of firearms, which I know sounds bizarre, and I'll contextualize. If a United States citizen living in, let's say, Idaho, because they have very lax gun laws, wants to buy a firearm from someone in, say, Alabama, where they also have very lax gun laws, as long as the buyer and seller have their paperwork, that firearm can be sold and transported to that other state, even though it passes through states where that firearm is not technically legal. And so, so it's a paradigm, it's a model that the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Bureau, the federal government already uses. It's somewhat analogous, although a little more macro, to in the United States, we still have dry counties, right? We have counties that have, you can't say people can't consume alcohol, but you can say people can't buy alcohol. And so people have to go to the next county over to buy booze. So ATF, covering those two functionalities, has an existing paradigm for limited interstate commerce that it looks like cannabis may fall under in the years to come.
And it's the reason why the interstate commerce is sort of, superseded by these other rules. Is that to purposely sort of, and I don't know if saying going over the federal government's head is the right word, but is that part of what's going on there, or
Well, it's not going over their head, right? I mean, the underlying basis of the Commerce Clause, and goodness, I don't want to misquote this because I'm sure there's somebody that's going to watch this that's a lawyer and be like, man, Ray got that way wrong. But the FBI was literally created because bootleggers could literally go over a state line and those cops couldn't get you in the other state because they didn't have the authority to go over. And so the Commerce Clause that allows the federal government to investigate and control interstate commerce is because states signed on to it. Because the senators and the congressmen that are the federal representatives of those states and of those constituents were like, yeah, that seems reasonable. As a result, there exists a paradigm where the federal government says, okay, person X in Alabama can own this gun, and person Y in Idaho can also own this gun. Person X wants to sell to person Y. Their state laws allow for it. Who are we to say no? And that's the theory.
Interesting. So more like,
not really a theory. I mean, it happens in other industries, but the thinking is that is the path of least resistance for limited interstate commerce in the cannabis industry. Also was the underlying legal argument for, you may have seen right when hemp was federally legalized, there were several massive shipments of industrial hemp that were interdicted in states that they then had to release the product to the owners, drop the charges, and quite frankly, pay restitution. Because the federal government was like, you can't stop them from doing this. We said it's okay. So it works both ways.
Interesting. So in certain ways, we're going to see the industry develop like wine, in certain ways like firearms, but ultimately, it's its very own industry of cannabis. And it's been
at the end of the day. So to your original question, 2, 3 to 5 years from now is going to be a transitionary phase. 10, 15, 20 years from now, this is going to be like going to buy a 6-pack. It's going to be like going to buy a pack of cigarettes. It's going to be whatever it is. And it's going to be dominated by the same sorts of modalities that dominate the CPG, the consumer packaged good market. It's going to cease to be an outlier and get brought in closer to the bell curve.
Interesting. And we talked a bit off air too about with the UN, classifying it in regards
That's
to
huge. Yes,
being a lower tier, drug. That is also going to have a global impact. So it'll be very interesting, especially as us sort of global nomads, seeing how the world changes. But
I mean, there are situations. I mean, you can look it up for yourself, but Canada exports, right? Because it's federally legal in Canada. So Canada exports to limited access medical markets in places like Germany. Jamaica exports, Uruguay, which federally legalized. So there are these limited access markets, very analogous to what I described between like Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and California, where you have consumer base and no supply chain. Well, in Canada, they have consumer base, or they have supply chain rather, and no consumer base. So in Canada, the federal government allows them to ship to other limited access countries. There was recently GW Pharma, which was a partially Canadian funded public company, if I'm getting the facts correct, but a British company that owns the US rights to Epidiolex, which is the first FDA approved CBD medicine for seizures, was recently acquired for $7.2 billion.
Wow. Who acquired it?
I forget the name of the company. It was some aggregate, including like GW Pharmaceuticals is a shareholder in the company that bought them. It was it's one of those, again, consolidate.
That's right. And that's sort of my impression too of what is to come, is we're going to see just more and more of the big players come in and, hey, I know people have issues with that too in certain ways, but overall as a population, maybe,
But in
that will
terms of
speak
access
up.
to capital, in terms of like stability of manufacturing, in terms of like uniformity, like, because listen, if you went to the store and every time you bought cornflakes, they were different, you'd stop buying cornflakes, right?
Mm,
Like there needs to be some uniformity. I mean, it's a very complex plant, and I don't want to, I don't want to mitigate how complex a medicine and a plant it is, but at the end of the day, people are going to want uniformity, and one of the ways that you can obtain uniformity on a economy of scale is quite frankly with infrastructure development that allows for that uniformity. Again, it was redundant, but whatever.
no, I agree. And I know what you mean. You need that capital, right? Or someone who could provide that capital to create that
Absolutely.
infrastructure.
I don't have this much money. I mean, like we've accomplished to date what we've done with just basically friends and family around and some dollars from angel investors. But we've sold off less than 7% of the company,
Mm,
and we're now in a position where, because of this change in federal banking laws, we may not have to sell off that more of it, because
mm,
private capital, venture capital tends to want equity for their dollars,
mm.
whereas banks and FDIC backed financial institutions, it's just a debt instrument. They don't actually want to own any of your, if you don't pay the debt back, then they recoup, then they own your shit. They're
Yeah.
not like coming right out the gate like, yes, I'll give you money in exchange for part of your company,
Mm.
which is
It,
how it is right now.
yeah, as you were saying, the vulture capitals. Although I got to be careful what I say, because I'm definitely going to have someone on probably in the near future who
Oh,
works
from a
with
VC firm? Yeah, dude.
capital.
They send them my way. Ha! I'm kidding.
But yeah,
Um, I do want to go back and just follow up, because I know it's an elongated tale, and I'm sure you'll edit this to how you see fit. But so from the time that we started the consulting firm,
mm,
we were introduced to a company in Las Vegas. Now, Nevada
mm,
going legal was huge,
yeah.
because, and again, Nevada is like one of those states, right? It's like the only state in the union where prostitution is legal, right? Which
Mm,
is theoretically federally illegal. But
yeah.
guess what? State law supersedes federal law in that particular case. Likewise with cannabis. We don't like that analogy as an industry. Obviously, it's vastly different because of the human impact, and I'm not gonna stand here and defend it. Although, again, in terms of harm reduction, arguably better. Nevada going legal is huge. And we were contacted by a colleague of ours who had been brought on as someone who had subject matter expertise, who was an SME in cannabis, to a very, very corporate client in
Mm,
Colorado, who it cost them several $1,000,000 to obtain one of, I believe at the time it was like one of 16 permits, right? So very closed. They had a huge dispensary right on the strip. I mean, it was crazy. So
mm,
they brought me in. They wanted me to help fix they had millions of dollars put into infrastructure, and the guy running it, which was not my buddy, which was a third party, had no idea what they were doing. They had completely misrepresented themselves to these corporate suits,
yeah.
who like took their story they took them at their word, and they
Mm,
hired them. And 6 months, 8 months later, they're running this $1,000,000 facility into the ground because they had no idea what they were doing. So I got brought in. They wanted to implement SOPs, implement control mechanisms to make sure the facility could function as they expanded their labor force and brought on people to train and all this kind of stuff. That ended up spiraling to a situation where they actually offered me basically a COO type position. And I said no. I turned it down because I was in Vegas for several months. Oh my goodness, that was awful. I'm not a Vegas guy.
yeah.
It was fun for like the first week, and then it was like, what? It's just you just
I hear living there is very different than visiting there. Yeah.
that is absolutely true. And I did come to find that out. But the fact of the matter is you still see some of the gnarlier sides of it, just even like driving to work, just like,
Mm,
yeah, it's like, that and you see it in San Fran, right? The tech millionaires going to work and they walk over people sitting on the street, right? It's a very gnarly thing, economic stratification is increasing. I don't think anyone would argue against that. But I didn't like it. And I didn't like the people. I didn't like the suits. They were like really dismissive. They were like, I was just some stoner that they thought could maybe help them out. I was like, you know what? This isn't even worth it. And the biggest turning point, and I want to say this because it's very important. I came home to Mount Shasta, and I told my buddy, the gentleman I referenced earlier, the city councilman, former mayor, who's like a mentor of mine, that I might be moving to Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And he was like, you can't do that. We need you. Mm-hmm. And that was such a humbling thing to like, this guy, he's late 70s, elder, right? Wise elder. Yeah. And he said to me, he goes, listen, I understand you need to make a living, but like, please don't abandon our community like so many other people of your age, quite frankly, have done, right? This is a guy, his grandkids live here, but his children left, or with one exception, his daughter's a teacher here. But like he witnessed this, right? This was a guy who served in the military, came back home, got a good paying job at a lumber mill. When the lumber mill went under, he went back to school. He became an elder care nurse in his 50s. And now 25 years later, he's like watching his community slowly decay. And he saw in me, I don't know, kind of like a hope, right? I guess, you hate to say that is because, I don't want to be egoistic about it, but he literally looked me in the eye. He goes, Ray, you can't leave. If you leave, what about all these plans we have? So for context there, I am on the board of a county economic development committee. I am the chair of our city economic development committee. I am a member of the Rotary, which is just wild. It's very funny to me. But, so I turned that job down, and part of the reason I turned that job down was because I realized that my community kind of needed this, right? Like no one else was stepping up with a project that would employ 300 people at $20 an hour. Yeah. No, there ain't another one of those on the back burner, right? We don't have a plan B. Yeah. The lumber industry, the timber industry is not coming back. The mining industry is not coming back. The cattle industry, the margins keep getting slimmer. And that's too heavy a land asset intensive industry for the average worker to be able to capitalize on it, because you need to own large tracts of land. Mm. And we had a very blunt conversation, and I went to the city council and I went to the city administrator and I said, look, like I have this nascent plan. If you guys engage in the state permitting procedure, we can establish employment opportunities that will long-term alleviate the economic stresses our community faces. Mm-hmm. And to my relief, it was well received. Wow. And that's how we got to where we are. That's why I said we had to bring it back to this, because that's really like I'm good at what I do. I can grow some good ganja. I know about product formulation. I'm good at policy and lobbying and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it took a community buy-in. It took people going, you know what? Everybody smokes weed. They already grow it illegally. Why wouldn't we engage the legal industry that's going to pay tax revenue and pay living wages? And, why in the world wouldn't we? And listen, there was a debate. I don't want to say it was like the next day we were good to go. In fact, from that point in time, it took over 2 years. The uglier part of that story that I didn't say there, and you please feel free to slice this in, I'll go back in character. So, my mentor, he described to me the level of apathy and how apathy had just kind of inserted itself into the community. And you just had this lack of drive from people, because people were like, this is how it is and it'll never change, because they didn't know it when it was better. Mm. The old timers are old. They're not in their 20s. They're not in their 30s. They're not starting new businesses. And so the community has been very stagnant since the lumber mill. The lumber mill in one day, the lumber mill went from employing almost 1,000 people to employing 300 people. Like they lost like 700 jobs in one day. Kind of like what I went through at Digital Domain, except it was the only employer in the community. Everybody worked at the mill. This town, this city was a company town until 1961. You could only live here if you worked at the mill, and the mill owned all the housing. The mill owned all the stores, right? The company store, the classic company store, right? It's the sold my soul to the company store, where you'd literally go in and you'd buy goods and they'd make a note. You didn't exchange any cash. They'd make a note and that got docked out of your next paycheck.
Crazy. And that's like what, 61. So, people are still alive that were there. Their parents would have been working there, kind of thing too, right? Or unless the elder you knew, he was old enough that he was probably an adult. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was in high school when the city incorporated.
Okay.
But I can tell you right now that, and actually this is like a whole other thing, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about this, but, I was also one of 9 named citizens in a lawsuit over the town's municipal water supply.
Yeah.
Which got me a lot of fucking credit.
Are they you sued them? What do you mean? What do you mean? You mean you sued them or they sued you? I don't get.
No. I was sued.
Yeah.
Along with 8 other individual citizens, 9 of us total.
Yeah.
Who again had the audacity to speak up at a public government meeting.
Yeah.
About a private corporation attempting to usurp control over the city's municipal water supply.
Oh, so the company went after you.
Yeah.
You guys won?
Yeah.
Nice.
It was actually found to be, it's called the SLAP suit. It's a strategic lawsuit against public participation. There are laws against them. They are very frequently used against people who protest things like resource extraction, fracking, pipelines, water bottling plants in our particular case.
Yeah.
So that's actually, I got to say, that's actually when the memoirs come out, that'll be one of the best chapters.
Definitely, man. That's cool though. That's Aaron Brockovich style, huh?
Totally. And so that group, that group to speak to the reason I brought it up was because you made a comment about community elders. That group of 9 people, I was the youngest person in that group by no shit 30 years.
Wow.
The oldest was a 94-year-old, 3-time former mayor.
My God. That's
the 9 persons included 3 former mayors, 4 former city councilmen. There was there's overlap there, right? So that's the same 4 people, 4 city councilmen, 3 of which were also mayor. One of the leading guys on the Historical Society and several times Citizen of the Year, Jim Taylor, and like a couple of other old time locals who actually bought their houses in 61. So in 61, when the city incorporated, if you lived in a company house, you had the right to buy that house at a certain rate. And it included, in the deed that came with the house, included the water service. And so one of the underlying premises of why we challenged this water right transfer was because there were neighborhoods whose original deeds included downstream usage rights to that same spring water.
I see. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. That what they're doing.
I'm the youngest person of the Weed 9. There was an article about us in the New York Times. There's a documentary about it.
Really? The Weed.
Yeah. The Weed 9. Yeah. And it's kind of like a Lebowski joke, right? Like the Seattle 7. And yeah, I was the youngest person in that group by 30 years. And the reason I was brought in to that group was because of those 9 citizens, I am one of 2 that has a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were like, Ray, we need you to help us write press releases and write letters to law firms, to the ACLU, to the Civil Liberties Defense Union, who ended up assisting us, to the First Amendment Project, who gave us free legal representation and beat the case back.
Wow.
Oh, it was wild, man.
I'll try to find that New York Times article and then
I'll send it to you. It was written by a gentleman named Thomas Fuller. It was like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe, when the suit was originally instigated. We were then tied up in court for the better part of 3 years, but we were dismissed from the suit, and it was declared to be a strategic lawsuit against public participation, which is expressly illegal.
Crazy. I was just looking for it right now.
Yeah, if you type in weed, California, water, New York Times, Fuller, F-U-L-L-E-R, it'll come up. So from the time that I turned down the gig in Vegas and I had the conversation with my mentor, and he said, you can't leave, we need you, right? It took approximately 2 years of community meetings. So what I did was I went to the city council and I requested the creation of a cannabis permitting and regulatory advisory committee that was open to the public, that I de facto chaired and would go in every 2 weeks for 10 months and gave presentations on the differences between illicit and regulated cannabis and the potential community benefits the industry could offer. Alongside me on that board was the chief of police at the time, who has since retired, the city manager, 2 city council persons, as well as several community leaders from churches, from the Sons of Italy, which is huge here because there's a lot of Italian folks of Italian descent that live here. All sorts of different folks from the community came out of the woodwork because they wanted to find out, what this was going to look like. Or for some of them, they came out to be like, not in my town, you're not. We walked it through. I was able to illustrate what a regulated marketplace looked like. I was able to illustrate what the realities were. And at the end of the day, there was a consensus reached that, okay, our community is very comfortable with what they call the core corporate client model. And that's a fancy word for a company town, just like the lumber mill used to be. You have one central employer. They provide living wage, generally manufacturing jobs. And those people then spend money at restaurants, at bars, at the bowling alley, at the movie theater, at shops. And it's a very, very common concept in urban and not even urban, just in land use and planning in general, right? When you talk about community resiliency and economic development. At the end of that, we engaged with the city to negotiate a bilateral contract, what's called the development agreement. It's a land use mechanism that allows for negotiations between a developer, which is basically what we are, right? We're an economic development firm and a land developer, and the jurisdictional municipality, the government. And it took about better part of 2 years, 2.5 years to finish that process. And, due to COVID, some other components, we did have a pretty substantial delay. But I'm proud to say that in November of last year, we walked away with full approvals for the project, which incorporates, approximately 600,000 square foot of greenhouse canopy, as well as nursery and genetics development for those greenhouses, processing, manufacturing, so the creation of things like edibles, vape cartridges, etc., and distribution. It's the reason that we call it we don't call it. The reason the nomenclature is it's a vertically integrated supply chain company, in that it is all components of the supply chain short of retail sales to the public. And we have approximately 60 acres of land that we recently started to do some site prep on. In fact, the drone survey just wrapped up so we can get all the drainage calculations, and we're currently in the midst of engineering and environmental review, and we look forward to breaking ground in the coming months.
Awesome. Sounds like big things are happening. And, again,
big things,
really
man.
To have you, man. And hopefully we'll have you back when we start to hit triple digits in the
sure, dude.
get the updates because everything seems fresh.
Yeah, and dude, a year from now, I won't be in my house with this terrible lighting. I'll have an office in one of our buildings, and I'll be able to like walk you through the greenhouses, show you the plants, all that shit.
Sounds good, man. Looking forward to it. And again, thank you for being a guest today on episode 62, Tokyo Alumni Podcast. That was Mr. Raymond.
Thank you so much. Go Mustangs.
All right, I'll see you around, man. Goodbye.
Yeah, absolutely, buddy.